Now, let me ask you something that might, at first, feel like an insult. What if I told you that you are asleep right now? Not physically. You are sitting, watching, listening. Your eyes are open. Your body is functioning. By every conventional measure, you are awake, but in a way that matters far more than the biological kind of wakefulness, in the way that determines the entire texture of your life, your choices, your suffering, your joy, your sense of who you are and what this is all for. You may not be awake at all. And here is the part that should stop you cold. You don't know it. You can't know it. Because the very mechanism that keeps you asleep is the same mechanism that convinces you, moment by moment, with quiet and relentless efficiency, that you are not, that everything is fine, that you are living your life, making your choices, being yourself, when in reality you may be doing almost none of those things. Now, this is not meant to disturb you for its own sake. Disturbance without direction is just anxiety, and we have more than enough of that already. This is meant to point at something that philosophers, mystics, monks, and some of the most penetrating minds in human history have been pointing at for thousands of years, something that hides so completely in plain sight that most people walk directly past it every single day, for their entire lives, without once catching a glimpse. Most people never wake up. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, the one that deserves our full attention, is not that they are unable to. The tragedy is that they never realize there is something to wake up to. They live and work and love and grieve and strive and eventually die. Inside a dream they never once questioned, because nothing in the dream ever suggested to them that it was one. Now, in Buddhism, this condition has a name. It is called moha, usually translated as delusion, but not delusion in the theatrical sense, not hallucination, not clinical madness, not the dramatic confusion of someone who has clearly lost their grip on reality. Something far quieter, far more pervasive, far more difficult to detect, precisely because it wears the face of the ordinary. A kind of fog, thick, comfortable, invisible. A fog that settles so gradually over the mind that you do not notice it arriving. And once it is fully present, it convinces the mind that what it is seeing through the fog is simply the world as it is, that the fog is not fog at all, that this is clarity, that is the genius of moha. It does not announce itself. It simply becomes the lens through which you experience everything. And here is the question that should not just interest you intellectually, but should land somewhere deeper, somewhere closer to the bone. What if almost everything you believe about yourself, who you are, what you want, what you fear, why you behave the way you do, what you are reaching for, what you are running from, what if almost all of it was never chosen? What if it was absorbed, installed, inherited, passed down through family systems and cultural narratives and institutional structures that were themselves the products of previous generations of unconscious people doing the same thing? What if the life you experience as yours in the most fundamental sense, the life you live from the inside, was not built by you but assigned to you? And what if you have been playing the role so completely, so continuously for so long, that you have forgotten entirely that you are playing it, What if the character is not you, but you have forgotten the difference? Now, we are going to move through this carefully, because this is not a comfortable idea. And I want to say something clearly about discomfort, because it will matter as we go deeper. Comfort, as we will discover, is one of the primary instruments of sleep. Not comfort in the sense of genuine ease or well-being. Those are precious things. But comfort in the sense of the avoidance of the unfamiliar, the reflexive reaching for the known, the choosing of the recognizable over the true when the true turns out to be more demanding than we expected. That kind of comfort is the friend of sleep and the enemy of waking. So if what we are about to explore produces some discomfort, some productive friction, some equality of not quite being able to settle, that may not be a sign that something is wrong. It may be a sign that something is beginning to be right. Because the question is not simply whether you are awake. The question, the more important question, the one that only you can answer is, do you want to be? Now, before we go further, we need to understand something foundational, something that Buddhism considers not just important, but the very root of the sleeping condition, the seed from which all the fog grows. And it is this: you believe you are a self. Now, I know, that sounds so obvious as to be almost offensive. Of course you are a self. You have a name, a face in the mirror, a history, a body, a set of memories that trail behind you like a weight. You experience yourself as a continuous, solid, coherent somebody moving through time. You feel yourself as real, more real, perhaps, than anything else in your experience, because everything else is perceived from here, from this vantage point, from this center. But what if this experience, this felt sense of being a fixed, separate, enduring you, is itself a construction? Not a lie, exactly, not a simple error, but a story, an enormously sophisticated, extraordinarily convincing, deeply habitual story, assembled moment by moment from fragments of sensation, memory, language, and social feedback. And then, at some point so early in your life that you cannot remember it, mistaken for something real and permanent. In Buddhism, this insight is called anatta, non-self, and it is perhaps the most radical and ultimately the most liberating idea in the entire contemplative tradition. Now, let us be very precise about what anatta does and does not mean, because this is where many people, when they first encounter the idea, either dismiss it entirely or misunderstand it in a way that drains it of its actual power. Anatta does not mean that you do not exist. It does not mean that your experiences are not real, that your suffering is imaginary, that your love for the people in your life is some kind of illusion to be transcended. That reading of the teaching is so far from what is being pointed at that it might as well be its opposite. What anatta means is something more surgical, more specific. It means that the self you take yourself to be, the fixed, isolated, unchanging, independently existing entity at the center of experience, does not have the solidity you attribute to it. It is more like a vortex in water than a stone in water. The vortex is real. It has shape, location, behavior, a kind of identity you can point to and describe. But there is no actual substance there. It is a pattern, a dynamic organization of processes that, when conditions are right, maintains a coherent form, and when conditions change, dissolves back into the larger movement it was always part of. You are more like that vortex than you are like a stone. And now consider what this means for how we live, because almost all human suffering, almost all the grasping and the pushing away, the anxiety and the grief, the need to be seen, and the fear of being exposed, is organized around the protection and enhancement of this story, this sense of self that feels so solid and so essential. We are insulted, and something in us contracts and burns, because the story has been threatened. We fail at something we cared about, and a particular kind of collapse occurs. Not just disappointment, but a kind of identity crisis. Because the story has been contradicted, we are left out, overlooked, not chosen, and the pain of it goes far deeper than the situation seems to warrant. Because the story was not validated, we achieve something significant, and instead of resting in the achievement, we almost immediately begin to wonder whether it is enough, whether it will last, whether others are impressed, because the story requires constant feeding, and we spend extraordinary energy, more than we can calculate, more than we would ever willingly choose to spend, managing this story, curating it, defending it, performing it for audiences real and imagined, feeding it achievements and relationships and possessions and positions and opinions, the way you feed wood into a fire that gives heat but never quite gives warmth. And nobody told you this was happening. Nobody stood you up as a child and said, "This mechanism you are about to spend your entire life organized around, this self-story, is something you will want to examine very carefully before you commit to it completely." Nobody said that, because the people who might have said it were themselves fully inside the same mechanism, with no more distance from it than you had. That is what sleep looks like. Not dramatic, not obviously wrong, simply the unexamined life playing out. Now, here is where it becomes even more intricate, because this sleeping self is not passive. It is not lying dormant. It is active, restless, industrious, even, generating thoughts with a speed and volume that, if you ever stop to notice it, is almost shocking. Estimates vary, but researchers suggest something in the range of 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day. Most of them repetitive, most of them variations on themes you have thought hundreds or thousands of times before. Most of them not about what is here, in this room, in this body, in this breath, but about elsewhere, about the past that cannot be changed, or the future that cannot be controlled, about the version of you that others see, and whether it is sufficient. The sleeping mind mistakes this noise for thinking, but it is not, in any rigorous sense, thinking. Thinking is directed, purposeful. It arrives somewhere. What the sleeping mind does, most of the time, is not thinking but ruminating, circling, returning again and again to the same unresolved questions, the same low-grade anxieties, the same rehearsals of conversations that never quite happen the way we rehearsed them, the ancient teachers would say. And this deserves to land carefully, that this ceaseless mental motion is not aliveness. It is a substitute for aliveness. It is the mind keeping itself so thoroughly occupied that it never has to encounter the raw, immediate, terrifying, beautiful fact of its own existence. This is the first mechanism of sleep, the noise, the relentless inner monologue that fills every silence before silence can say anything true. Now, having seen the sleeping self, this constructed, defended, endlessly generating story, we need to understand what sustains it, what maintains the fog at such consistent density. And here we encounter something that is genuinely difficult to look at directly, because it implicates not just the individual mind, but the entire architecture of the world most of us were born into. The sleeping self is sustained by conditioning. Now, conditioning sounds clinical, detached. It does not carry the emotional weight of what it actually represents, which is this: from the moment you arrived in the world, before you could speak, before you could reason, long before you could evaluate or question or choose, you were being shaped by the emotional climate of your earliest relationships, by the fears and aspirations and unresolved wounds of your parents and their parents before them, by the culture you were immersed in before you knew you were being immersed, by the religion or its absence, by the particular slice of history you were born into, by your teachers, your peers, the stories your society told about who matters and who does not, what constitutes a worthwhile life, what success looks and feels like, what you are supposed to want. All of this arrived before you were equipped to examine it. It did not ask for your consent because you were not yet the kind of being capable of giving or withholding consent. It simply accumulated, layer by layer, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river, gradually, silently, until the riverbed is no longer what it once was. In Buddhism, these accumulated patterns are called samskaras, deep impressions in the mind, formed by repetition and charged by emotion. Grooves, you might say, ruts in a dirt road. Every time a wheel passes through, the rut deepens, until eventually the wheel cannot go anywhere else, not because it is physically prevented, but because the path of least resistance, the path of the familiar, the automatic, the habitual, has become so well worn that deviation requires a kind of effort that most people never think to make, because they never realize the rut is a rut, and not simply the road. And here is the quality of conditioning that makes it so effective as a mechanism of sleep. It does not feel like conditioning. It feels like you. It feels like your personality, your preferences, your values, your gut instincts, the things that go without saying, because they have always gone without saying, because they were never said. They were simply there from the beginning, before you had the tools to notice them as something that arrived, rather than something that always was. So now, I invite you, genuinely invite you, not rhetorically, to sit with the question. How much of what you believe about yourself was actually chosen? Not accepted, not absorbed, not inherited, but chosen, in a moment of genuine reflection, by a person with enough freedom and self-knowledge to make the choice consciously. How much of your ambition was planted before you were old enough to evaluate whether it was the kind of ambition you would have grown in yourself if left to your own nature? How much of your fear was borrowed from people who were themselves carrying fears borrowed from their parents in an unexamined chain of inherited anxiety reaching back further than any of them knew. How many of your opinions about yourself, about others, about what life is and what it is for, are genuinely yours? And how many are simply the water you have been swimming in for so long that you forgot entirely that you were wet? Now, I am not saying this to generate guilt or despair. Not at all. The purpose of seeing this is not to feel bad about it. The purpose is recognition, because you cannot question what you cannot see. You cannot evaluate what you are completely identified with. You cannot choose differently from what you have always chosen while you remain entirely unconscious of the mechanism that has been doing the choosing. The fish does not see the water. That is not the fish's failure. It is simply the condition of total immersion. But the moment attention turns toward the water, the moment some quality of awareness begins to notice the automatic responses, the inherited fears, the borrowed beliefs, the unquestioned assumptions, something begins. Something small, but of tremendous consequence. A gap appears between stimulus and response, between trigger and reaction, between what happens and the story the mind immediately tells about what happened. Just a crack at first, almost imperceptible, but a crack nonetheless. And in that crack, that small trembling space, there is the first stirring of freedom. Now, let us go deeper still, because conditioning, while essential to understand, is only one layer of the sleeping mechanism. There is something operating beneath it, or perhaps alongside it, that is even more central to the suffering of ordinary unconscious life. Something that Buddhism identified with extraordinary precision millennia before modern psychology arrived at similar conclusions through entirely different routes. It is what I will call the comparing mind. Now, the sleeping self does not merely experience life. That would almost be bearable. The sleeping self evaluates life constantly, without pause, without mercy. Every moment, every sensation, every encounter, every achievement, every failure, immediately sorted, measured, ranked against an invisible standard. Good or bad, enough or not enough, better or worse than yesterday, better or worse than them, closer to or further from some imagined ideal. This comparing mind is not in itself pathological. Comparison in limited doses has real utility. It helps calibration, learning, adjustment. The problem is not comparison. The problem is the relentless, compulsive, involuntary form comparison. Takes in the sleeping mind. The form in which it operates not occasionally as a useful tool, but continuously as a kind of background radiation, coloring every experience before it can simply be experienced. You look at your life and compare it to a version of your life that exists nowhere except in your imagination, and come up inadequate. You achieve something that required genuine effort and genuine courage, and before the satisfaction can even settle, the comparing mind has already located 3 people who achieved more, done it faster, made it look effortless, and the satisfaction evaporates, unreached. You sit in a room full of people, and instead of simply being among them, some part of the mind is perpetually running a calculation. Who has more? Who has less? Who is watching? How am I landing? Am I the kind of person who belongs in a room like this? Now, the Buddha called this dukkha, usually rendered as suffering in English, which is accurate, but perhaps too dramatic, for what is often a very subtle thing. The better rendering might be the unsatisfactoriness of experience, when it is always filtered through grasping, comparing, evaluating. The feeling that something is slightly off, that this moment, whatever this moment is not quite enough, not quite right, not quite what it should be. That persistent, low-grade, almost atmospheric sense of incompleteness. That is not a sign that something is wrong with your life. It is a sign of the comparing mind at work. It is the noise the sleeping self makes when it measures this against that, and always finds something missing. Because here is what the waking sees that the sleeping cannot. The incompleteness is not in the life. The incompleteness is in the comparing. Remove the lens of comparison, just for a moment, just for one unhurried breath, and the moment, exactly as it is, reveals itself to be already whole. Not perfect, not always comfortable, not always what you would design if you were designing, but whole. It's complete, not lacking the thing that the comparing mind says it lacks, because the comparing mind generated the lack. The moment itself came without it. Imagine what it would actually feel like to encounter your morning without the evaluating lens, not measuring it against yesterday or imagining something better. Just light at a specific angle through a specific window, the particular texture of silence before the day has filled itself with noise. The actual weight of your own body, which you almost never feel, because you are almost always thinking about something else. The sheer strangeness and specificity of being alive in this moment, which will not occur again anywhere ever. That is not passivity. That is not resignation. That is something far more difficult than comparison and far more rewarding. That is presence. And presence, genuine, unmediated, unfiltered presence, is one of the primary textures of what it means to be awake. Now, here is something that almost nobody wants to look at, because it is uncomfortable, not merely personally, but socially. It challenges not just your own inner life, but the fabric of the world you share with others. If we are asleep, and we have been asleep for a long time, and almost everyone around us is also asleep, why has no one noticed? Why does the sleepwalking feel so thoroughly, so convincingly, so unquestionably normal? The answer is simple, and it is devastating, because we are surrounded by other sleepwalkers. Now, let me be careful here, because this is where a teaching like this can go wrong and produce its own particular kind of sleep, the sleep of superiority, of spiritual arrogance, of the person who has read enough to believe they are awake, and everyone else is not. That is perhaps the most seductive dream of all, and it is one we need to name and set aside immediately. To say we are surrounded by sleepwalkers is not a judgment. It is not a hierarchy. It is an observation about the shared human condition, because the people in your life who appear to be most thoroughly unconscious, most driven by unexamined patterns, most defended, most reactive, are almost certainly doing so with complete sincerity. They are not pretending. They are not choosing unconsciousness. They are living inside the only version of reality that has been made available to them by a world that was itself built largely by people operating in the same condition. This is what the Buddhist tradition means when it speaks of samsara. Not merely personal suffering, but the collective dream. The shared, intergenerational, culturally reinforced consensus about what reality is and what life is for. That gets transmitted from parent to child, from institution to individual, from culture to consciousness, without ever being paused and examined. And here is the thing about shared dreams. They acquire a gravity, a solidity. When everyone around you is dreaming the same dream, the dream stops feeling like a dream. It begins to feel like reality, because reality for most of us is largely a social construction. It is what we agree to call real, what we validate in each other, what we reinforce through shared behavior and shared assumption. This is why waking up is not merely a personal achievement. It is a social act, and it is in a very real sense an act of courage, not dramatic courage, not the kind that involves visible risk and public acknowledgement, but the quieter, more sustained, more demanding courage of being willing to see clearly when clarity is socially inconvenient, of being willing to notice the dream when everyone around you is invested in the dreaming, of following genuine inquiry wherever it leads, even when it leads into territory that has no map, no community, no established consensus to lean on. Now, and this is important, this does not mean isolation. It does not mean contempt. It does not mean the awakening person stands apart, looking down from some elevated position at the sleeping masses below. In fact, the genuine movement toward waking produces almost the exact opposite of that. It produces compassion, a deepening, aching compassion for the difficulty of the human situation, for how little choice most people have had in any of this, for how sincere the confusion is, for how real the suffering is, even when its causes are invisible to the one who is suffering. And this compassion, this quality of genuinely caring about the well-being of others, without needing them to be different from what they are, without needing to fix or convert or enlighten them, this may be one of the most reliable signs that waking is actually occurring. Now, we have been circling something, going around the edges of it, and it is time to move toward the center. What is it exactly that wakes up, and what does it wake up to? Because if we have established that the sleeping self is a construction, a story, a pattern, a very convincing fiction, maintained by conditioning, and the comparing mind, and the social reinforcement of shared dreaming, then the question naturally arises, is there something beneath or behind this construction that is more real? Something that is not the story, and the answer that the contemplative traditions give, with remarkable consistency, across cultures and centuries that had no contact with each other, is yes. But it is not another thing. It is not another object of experience that you find, the way you might find a coin on the ground. It is not a higher self, a better version of yourself, a more enlightened future you. It is something far simpler and far stranger than any of that. It is the awareness that is already here, that has always been here, the background consciousness in which all experience arises and dissolves, the space, if space is even the right word, in which thoughts appear and disappear, emotions come and go, sensations arise and fade. the presence that is aware of the noise, but is not itself the noise, the stillness that is aware of the movement, but is not itself moved. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, this is called Rigpa, pure awareness. In the Vedantic tradition, it is called Turiya, the fourth state, the state that underlies and pervades waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. In Zen, it is pointed at rather than named, because naming it immediately makes it into another object, another thing the conceptual mind can acquire and organize and compare. And here is what makes this discovery, because discovery is the right word, not achievement, not attainment, but the rediscovery of something that was always already the case. Here is what makes it so radical. This awareness has never not been here. It was present in your most joyful moments and your most devastating ones. It was present in your clearest thinking and your most confused. It was present in childhood, and it is present now, and it will be present in the final moment of your life. As whatever arises is witnessed, in whatever way it is witnessed. It is the most constant thing about you, more constant than your name, which changes across different mouths, more constant than your opinions, which change across different decades, more constant than your body, which is entirely different in its cellular composition from what it was 7 years ago, more constant than your sense of self, which varies enormously depending on whether you slept well, whether you were praised or criticized, whether you are in the company of people who know you or strangers who don't. The awareness is the constant. The story is the variable. And we have spent almost all our attention on the variable and almost none on the constant, because the constant doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for attention. It simply is. Meditation, and I use that word broadly, to cover the entire range of contemplative practices that point in this direction, is essentially the practice of turning attention toward this awareness itself, not toward an object within awareness, not toward a thought about awareness, but toward the awareness that is aware. And what practitioners report again and again across traditions so different, they might seem to have nothing in common, is this turning. This simple act of the awareness recognizing itself changes something fundamental, not by rearranging the contents of your life, not by eliminating suffering or complexity or the natural grief of an impermanent existence, but by changing the ground from which all of that is met, by shifting the perspective from inside the story to somewhere larger than the story, and from that larger perspective, which is not cold or detached, but actually more fully present, more capable of genuine contact, more open to the full range of experience, everything looks different. Not because the world has changed, because the eye that is looking has changed. Now, let us be practical for a moment. Because ideas, even beautiful and penetrating ideas, can become their own form of sleep if they remain only ideas. If they circulate endlessly in the thinking mind without ever landing in the body, in the breath, in the actual texture of lived experience. So let me ask you something very simple. Right now, in this moment, are you aware? Not aware of something in particular, not aware of the words you are hearing, or the room you are in, or the thoughts that are moving at the edges of your attention, but simply aware? Is there a quality of knowing? of presence, of being here that is occurring right now, prior to any specific content. Can you notice that? And if you can notice it, and I think if you pause long enough to genuinely look, you will find that you can. Then you have just made contact with the thing we are pointing at, not as a concept, as direct experience. This is what the practice of sati, clear-seeing mindfulness, is pointing toward, not the accumulation of calm, though calm may arise, not the elimination of thought, though the noise may quiet, but the capacity to be aware of what is happening, including what is happening in the mind, without being entirely swept away by it, to have experience without being entirely consumed by experience, to feel thought without being thought, to be moved by emotion without being lost in it. Now, the sleeping mind will object at this point, loudly perhaps. It will say, this sounds like passivity, like resignation, like floating above life rather than engaging with it, like giving up the very drive and desire and ambition that makes things happen. And I want to take that objection seriously, because it is not entirely wrong. There are forms of spiritual practice that are essentially a sophisticated form of dissociation, a way of not feeling rather than feeling more clearly, a way of rising above experience rather than meeting it more fully. And those forms are worth examining and, in most cases, rejecting. But what the genuine contemplative traditions point toward is not less engagement with life. It is fuller engagement, more complete, less filtered, less mediated by the constant evaluating, comparing, defending commentary of the sleeping mind. The awareness that recognizes itself is not cold. It is not detached. It is, if anything, more sensitive, more permeable to experience, more capable of genuine contact with the reality of another person, more moved by beauty, more present to grief, more available to joy, precisely because it is not organized around protection, because it does not need to defend a story, because it is not measuring this moment against a preferred moment. The difference between the sleeping engagement with life and the awakened one is not the difference between caring and not caring. It is the difference between grasping and truly touching, between clutching and holding, between the tight grip of the frightened and the open hand of the genuinely alive. Now, here is something we have to address directly, because it is the point at which many people who become interested in awakening go sideways. Waking up becomes a project, and the moment it becomes a project, the moment the sleeping self takes the concept of awakening and organizes its goal setting, its striving, its timeline building, its comparative self-assessment around the pursuit of enlightenment, something has gone profoundly, almost comically, wrong, because the self that wants to wake up is the same self that is asleep. And it wants to wake up in the way it wants everything else, as an acquisition, a destination, an achievement that will finally, definitively, settle the question of adequacy, a state that can be reached, held, compared favorably to other people's states, and used as confirmation that the story of the self is, after all, a good one. This is the spiritual ego, and it is arguably more difficult to see through than the ordinary ego, because it is wearing the costume of humility and seeking. The Zen teachers knew this. They watched it happen. generation after generation, in their students and in themselves. Students who came in genuine distress and genuine curiosity, who began to practice with genuine dedication, and who over time developed a very particular kind of rigidity, an investment in their own progress, an attachment to their own awakening. And the teachers, the good ones, found ways to disrupt this, sometimes gently, sometimes with a kind of shocking directness that left the student without a foothold, because the entire enterprise of the spiritual self, the self that is working toward liberation, is built on a misunderstanding of what liberation is. Liberation is not an achievement. It is the recognition that there was never anything to achieve, that the ground you were looking for was always already the ground you were standing on, that the awareness you were seeking was always already the awareness that was seeking. Now, when this lands, not as a thought, but as actual recognition, there is often something that feels like embarrassment, like discovering that you have been searching frantically for your glasses while wearing them. The search itself was the problem, not because searching is wrong in some absolute sense, but because this particular thing cannot be found by searching, because it is the finder. So what to do with this? The instruction, if we must have one, is paradoxical but precise. Stop trying to get somewhere and start paying attention to where you already are, not as a permanent state of sitting still, not as the abandonment of action or engagement or aspiration, but as a fundamental reorientation of the quality of attention, from future-oriented, goal-directed, achievement-seeking attention to present, open, genuinely curious attention, from the tightness of the grasping hand to the openness of the receiving hand. This is what the Taoists meant by wu-wei. Not the absence of action, but action that arises from a still center rather than from agitation. Effort that doesn't strain. Movement that doesn't resist. And the strange thing, the thing that you cannot quite believe until you experience it, is that this quality of attention is not less effective than the striving kind. It is in many ways considerably more effective, because it is not distorted by fear, because it is not filtering experience through the lens of what it needs to become, because it is actually available to the reality in front of it, rather than half present and half somewhere else, planning and worrying and rehearsing. Now, let us speak about what this actually looks like in practice, because I think we owe each other that concreteness, because philosophy that stays abstract becomes another furniture of the sleeping mind, interesting ideas to think about, to share at dinner parties, to feel slightly superior for having encountered. And that is precisely the trap we are trying to avoid. So what does the beginning of waking up look like in the ordinary life of an ordinary person? It looks like this. You are in a conversation, and someone says something that triggers a familiar reaction, irritation, defensiveness, the urgent need to correct them or be seen correctly. And instead of simply acting from that reaction, something in you notices it, just notices, a small, clear observation. There it is again, that thing, the familiar tightening, the story beginning to generate itself. You do not necessarily do anything different in that moment. You may still respond in the habitual way, but something has seen it, and that seeing, even without changing the behavior, is the beginning. Or you are scrolling through your phone, doing the thing that the sleeping mind does to fill every available silence with stimulation, and something in you notices the quality of the scrolling, the slight anxiousness of it, the way it is not quite satisfying, but also impossible to stop, the way it seems to be offering connection or information or entertainment, but is actually, on examination, generating a kind of low-grade restlessness that was not quite there before you started. You notice that, you put the phone down, not forever, not with dramatic resolve, just for now. And in the moment of putting it down, you feel the silence, the actual silence that was available all along, underneath the noise you were generating to avoid it. And in that silence, just for a moment, something rests. That is waking up. Not a sudden illumination in a cave in India, not a mystical experience in a Tibetan monastery. The quiet, unremarkable, revolutionary act of noticing what is actually happening in the body, in the mind, in the moment, instead of running on autopilot through it. This is available to you right now. In your ordinary life, in your ordinary circumstances, with your ordinary mind, which is not broken, not inadequate, not too conditioned or too distracted or too far gone. Right now, in this moment, you have the capacity to notice what is occurring, to feel the weight of your body in the chair, to hear the particular quality of silence or sound around you, to sense, without labeling or evaluating, the condition of your own inner atmosphere, open or contracted, clear or clouded, restless or at ease. That noticing, that simple, unforced, unprogrammed act of attention, is what the entire contemplative tradition has been pointing at for thousands of years across every language and culture and philosophical framework that has grappled seriously with the question of what it means to be conscious and alive, not some exotic state. This, exactly this. Now, I want to say something as we come toward the end of this conversation that I think is probably the most important thing. Most people never wake up. We said that at the beginning, and we have spent all this time exploring why. The constructed self, the conditioning, the comparing mind, the social reinforcement of collective sleep, the spiritual ego that turns awakening into another project. All of that is real. All of it is worth seeing clearly. But here is the thing that I do not want to get lost in all of that understanding. Waking up is possible, not as a final, permanent, once-and-for-all state of achieved perfection. The tradition is largely agreed that the idea of a permanent, unshakable, never again disturbed enlightenment as a thing that ordinary human beings achieve and then simply live in forever is mostly a myth that, ironically, keeps many seekers from beginning, because the standard seems impossibly high. What is possible, what is actually, practically, in this lifetime available, is something more humble and more radical than that. A deepening quality of wakefulness, a gradual, sometimes halting, sometimes surprisingly swift movement toward less automaticity, less reactivity, less identification with the story, and more contact with the awareness that is aware of the story. A life that is increasingly lived from the inside rather than performed for the outside. Choices that are increasingly genuinely chosen rather than compulsively repeated. Relationships that are increasingly genuine encounters between real people rather than the collision of defended stories. This is not a small thing. This is, in fact, the whole thing. This is what a human life is capable of becoming when it is genuinely inhabited rather than merely lived through. And the first step, the only step there is, repeated endlessly, is the one you can take right now. Not tomorrow, when you have more time or less stress or a meditation practice established or a different set of circumstances. Now, in this exact moment, with this exact mind, in this exact situation, carrying all the conditioning and history and complexity you are actually carrying. Just notice the quality of this moment. Notice whether you are here or elsewhere. Notice the story that is running, if one is running. Notice the awareness that is noticing all of that. Just for a second, just for one breath. Not as a technique, not as a step towards somewhere else, but as the simplest and most fundamental act of intelligence available to a human being. The recognition of what is already here. Now, the sleeping mind will forget this. It will forget it in 10 minutes, possibly in 10 seconds. And when it forgets, and you notice that it forgot, that noticing is itself waking up again, you cannot fail at this. Because even recognizing that you have been asleep is a form of being awake. Even the moment of, oh, I was lost again, is a moment of presence. The gap between losing attention and recovering it is the practice. And each time the gap gets a little bit shorter. Each time the recovery is a little bit quicker. Each time the noticing is a little bit more immediate. And this is not something you can measure or achieve or compare. It simply deepens in the way that understanding deepens, not suddenly, but inevitably, like the unhurried, undeniable work of water on stone. Something softens, something opens, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself or performs itself for others. In the way that genuine things happen, which is quietly beneath the notice of everything except awareness itself, the fog thins. Not all at once, not forever, but enough that sometimes, in the middle of your ordinary day, you look up and realize that you can see a little further than you could before. And in that moment, however brief, however unspectacular, you are awake. Which means you know something most people never know, not something superior, something simple, that the dream was a dream, and that you, the one who was dreaming, have never, not for a single moment, been anything other than already, entirely, perfectly awake. You have simply been forgetting. And now you remember. Now, before the music rises and the moment ends, I want to speak about something that is rarely discussed in conversations about awakening, something that is almost too simple to seem worth saying. And yet, I have come to believe. It may be the most practically important piece of all of this, the role of the body. We talk about the mind. We talk about awareness. We talk about consciousness and the self and the story and the fog, and all of that matters. But there is something that almost the entire Western philosophical tradition has systematically undervalued, and that the contemplative traditions, almost unanimously, have insisted upon. You cannot wake up from the neck up. The body is not an obstacle to awakening. It is not the lower, denser, less spiritual part of you that needs to be transcended, so that the higher, purer awareness can emerge. This is a deep misunderstanding that has caused enormous suffering, particularly in Western religious traditions that inherited a distrust of the body, a sense that flesh is the enemy of spirit. The body, in the Buddhist and Taoist and Vedantic understanding, is not the enemy of awareness. It is one of its primary vehicles. The breath, which you are breathing right now without attending to it, is among the most direct entries into the present moment available to a human being, because the breath is always here. It does not exist in the past or the future. You cannot breathe yesterday's breath. You cannot breathe tomorrow's. You can only breathe this one. And so the moment you actually feel your breath, not think about your breath, not monitor it with clinical detachment, but actually feel the sensation of air entering and leaving the body, the slight rise and fall of the chest or the belly, the quality of the pause between the out-breath and the next in-breath. In that moment, you are in the present, not by effort, not by technique, by the simple fact that the breath only exists here. This is why every major contemplative tradition across history has used the breath as a foundational practice, not because breathing is magical, but because attention to the breath is attention brought home. It is the scattered, time-traveling, story-generating mind being invited back to the one place it can actually be, here. And from here, from the felt sense of inhabiting your own body in your own moment, everything else is possible. The recognition of awareness, the loosening of the story, the meeting of experience without the constant mediation of evaluation, the quality of presence that is, in the end, what we mean by being awake. So, perhaps the most practical instruction I can offer, after all of this philosophy, all of this careful exploration of the mechanisms of sleep and the nature of waking, is this. Feel your feet on the ground. Right now, the actual physical sensation, the contact of your body with the surface that is supporting it, the weight of yourself here in this moment on this earth. And then breathe, one breath, all the way in, all the way out, without going anywhere. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the entire practice in miniature. The whole of what the tradition is pointing at, compressed into a single breath, taken with full attention. And if you can do that, if you can be fully present for one breath, you can be present for the next, and the next, and the next. And a life built from such moments, however imperfectly, however intermittently, is already a different kind of life than the one that is lived entirely in the noise. Now, there is one more thing, one final thing that deserves to be said plainly. This conversation, everything we have explored together, is not meant to give you answers. It is meant to sharpen your questions, the right questions, the questions that actually matter, as opposed to the questions the sleeping mind endlessly generates in order to maintain the impression of searching, while avoiding the actual confrontation with what is here. The sleeping mind loves to think about awakening. It loves to accumulate knowledge about consciousness, to compare spiritual traditions, to assess its own progress, to wonder whether it is doing it right, to speculate about what enlightenment would feel like if it arrived. All of that is fine. Some of it is genuinely useful. But none of it is the thing. The thing is always this moment, this awareness, this breath, this body, this life exactly as it is, not as it should be or might be or once was or could become, but as it is right now in all its imperfect, unresolved, perpetually unfinished glory. The Zen masters had a phrase, "This very place is the lotus land, this very body the Buddha," which is to say, the liberation you are seeking is not in a different place, a different time, a different state of consciousness than the one you are in right now. It is not an improvement on this moment. It is this moment seen without the fog. The fog thins when we stop feeding it, when we pause the constant commentary, when we let the comparing mind grow still, even briefly, when we stop measuring this moment against an imagined better one, and simply, fully, without reservation, allow it to be what it is. Not perfectly, not permanently, but repeatedly, gently, without judgment for the times we forget, because forgetting is part of it, because waking is not a destination, but a direction. Not a thing you arrive at, but a thing you practice. Not a state you achieve, but a quality of attention you return to, again and again and again, for the rest of your life. And in the returning, not in the arrival, but in the returning, there is something that the sleeping life never quite finds, and that no achievement or possession or relationship or success or recognition can provide. There is rest, real rest, not the rest of exhaustion, not the rest of giving up, but the rest of a mind that has stopped fighting the present moment and learned, slowly and with great patience, and with a humor that only comes from seeing how long and how diligently you fought. What was always already fine, learned to simply be here, where you have always been, where you could not have been anywhere else. And now you remember